Welcome ladies and gentlemen to my channel. This is Mon, and in this guide you'll learn how to build and play the buffed Bullseye shotgun, Doombringer. But before we go over its weapon features to understand how the weapon works, let me know in the comments which build you'd like to see next. And with that, starting with the first feature, 30% chance to trigger the Bullseye effect when hitting enemies, with the chance increasing to 80% on targets within 5 meters. Now if you don't know what Bullseye is, it is a debuff that applies 8% vulnerability to enemies for 12 seconds. Now back to the weapon features, the second feature is after hitting a marked target with all pellets from a single shot, you gain 6% attack for 15 seconds, stacking up to 5 stacks. And this effect only lasts while the Doombringer is in your hands. Now if you don't know, attack is pretty much the base damage stat for bullet damage, and after reading the first two features, it should be pretty obvious that this gun is only really good close range, because otherwise you struggle with marking enemies, and you'll also not get the big attack buffs. Now for the next feature, after triggering the Bullseye, you gain 5% damage reduction for 8 seconds, stacking up to 4 times, which is pretty nice. And lastly, you gain a massive 30% crit rate buff when hitting marked targets. So from all these weapon features, we know that this is a pure physical weapon, so weapon blueprint stars will matter a lot for this weapon's damage. And this gun can also only be played close range. Now you can do a weak spot build of this weapon, but in this guide I won't cover it. So if you want to see the weak spot build of this weapon, let me know in the comments. But moving on to the calibration, you pretty much have two options, lightweight style and heavy style. And between the two, heavy style calibration will be the better option. Now as for the calibration substats, you can either go with double crit rate or crit damage and crit rate. They will both perform very similarly in terms of damage. Just make sure to not use double crit damage, cause then you'll lack crit rate. Now another thing is, if you use double crit rate, just be careful of all your crit rate sources, so your mods, gear set and whatnot, as to just not overflow on your crit rate stats, cause any crit rate above 100% is wasted stats. Moving on to the accessories and ammo, starting with the tactics, you're going to want to run the tactical laser sight, which is going to be very important in order for you to hit all of your pellets for each shot. Because of course, if you don't, you lose out on the attack bonus buffs. Then for the ammo, the best types of ammo to use is going to be either smart shotgun ammo, suppression shotgun ammo, or penetration shotgun ammo, depending on the type of content that you're clearing. Moving on to deviation, you have two options, the Zap Cam and the Lone Wolf, which both give the same amount of weapon damage bonus as long as they're the same level, and at max level, they will both give 43.2% weapon damage bonus. Now the first and best option usually will be Lone Wolf. The reason for this is because it can draw aggro by default, and the second reason is due to it having a lunar variant, which will permanently grant a 5% to 7.5% weapon damage bonus depending on your sanity. However, in scenarios where the Lone Wolf cannot physically reach enemies, you will want to use the Zap Cam. This is because if the Lone Wolf doesn't hit the enemy itself, it will not grant the big amount of weapon damage bonus. Moving on to the secondary and melee weapon options, you have a few options. You have the Bingo, the Wildfire, and the Recurve Crossbow. Now, because Bullseye weapons can fully make use of weak spot damage bonus thanks to a key gear, you're going to pretty much always prefer Bingo, because it gives a massive 45% weak spot damage bonus. And not only that, after defeating an enemy with a weak spot hit with the Bingo, you also get 15% attack for 20 seconds. So this is going to be the strongest option. Now, if you haven't unlocked the Bingo yet, then sure, you could run the Wildfire or the Recurve Crossbow. Now, the Crossbow gives 15% crit rate, which is really great as well. However, you do have to be careful of your total possible crit rate values, because you might go over 100% crit rate, and if you go over that number, well, the excess crit rate is pretty much wasted. Moving on to the melee weapon, the best melee weapon to use is going to be the Kukri, and the reason for this is because if you take a look at the weapon features, defeating a target grants all weapons attack plus 30% and crit rate plus 15% for 10 seconds. So this is a massive buff, this is incredible for burst damage, and of course it's just the best option. And the easiest way to trigger those buffs would be with the sticky ice crystals that are made by the ice pod Deviation. So with the sticky ice crystals, what you can do is you just throw the ice crystals on the ground and then you just destroy it with a Kukri. And if you take a look at my buff lists, you'll see that here I get 30% attack and 15% crit rate. Now moving on to key gear, for the Doombringer, you essentially have two options. You have the old Huntsman boots and you also have the Earthly boots. Now for the Earthly boots, it's essentially when hitting marked enemies, damage plus 30%, which is translated as other damage bonus, so damage bonus against the X-type, and as you can see here, damage bonus against targets with the Bullseye, 30%, and this is really strong. However, for the old Huntsman boots is after triggering the Bullseye, the next 1 bullets hitting a marked target will count as weak spot hits even if they do not hit any weak spot. And you also get 30% weak spot damage bonus to enemies affected by the Bullseye. Now, if you're wondering which one is the best between these two, well, it's going to depend. So if you're just killing normal enemies, or if an enemy has weak spots that you can easily hit, then Earthly boots will be the best option. However, if you're bossing and the boss does not have any weak spots, so for instance the fridge in PSI silo, then you're definitely gonna want to use the old Huntsman boots, because during those burst situations against bosses, if the boss doesn't have any weak spots, you lose all weak spot damage bonus coming from the Bingo. Now let's talk about gear sets. But before we do, if you enjoy my content or wish to see more Once Human guides, then I'd really appreciate it if you liked this video, subscribe to my channel, and turned on the bell for any notifications. But now, let's talk about gear sets. Starting with the strongest option, that will be the low HP preset, which is 3-piece Treacherous and 2 Lone Wolf pieces. The 2 Lone Wolf pieces will give you magazine capacity bonus, which will allow your Doombringer to have 4 bullets in its magazine instead of 3, and it'll also give a very important 5% crit rate bonus. Then as for the 3-piece Treacherous, the 3-piece bonus and the 2-piece bonus combined will give you a total of 50% permanent weapon damage bonus. So currently I have this set equipped, and if I take a look at my stat sheet, you'll see that I have 50% weapon damage bonus. Now by the way, it also gives 50% status damage bonus, which you can also see right here. But of course, to have all of these buffs, you'll have to lower your sanity right here. So currently I'm sitting at 0% sanity, but that's just so that I benefit the most of my lunar mods as well. But in order to reduce your sanity, you're going to want to eat a plethora of food items, so you have a lot of choices. So for instance, you can eat the sanity corrosion capsules, which will reduce your sanity by 100 points by default. Or you could also eat spoiled food, which will also reduce your sanity, but by 200 points instead. Now, if you're not comfortable at playing at that low of an HP percent, then you can definitely opt for 3-piece Lone Wolf and 2-piece Treacherous. The 2-piece Treacherous will give you permanent 12% weapon damage bonus, but you'll have to lock your HP at 70% instead of the 40% that I was sitting at. And the 3-piece Lone Wolf this time will give you stacking crit damage bonus, stacking up to 48%. But by default, this will be weaker than the previous preset due to the simple fact that this time you will actually have to stack up your damage buffs. And lastly, if you don't want to play with your HP at all, then you definitely want to go for 4-piece Lone Wolf with 1-piece Bastille or 1-piece Renegade. So 1-piece Bastille, as long as you're comfortable with having your HP kept above 70%, you will get 10% weapon damage bonus permanently. But if you don't want that, then you can still go for Renegade for that 15% reload speed bonus. And as for the Lone Wolf, the 4-piece will increase your stackable crit rate up to 60%. And each time you reload, you'll get 8% crit rate for 2 seconds, which is great for the Doombringer as well. But of course, this will be the weakest preset in terms of damage. Moving on to Cradle perks, I'm currently in a non-novice scenario, so I'll go over those Cradle perks. You're going to want Anti-Void for the shotgun damage bonus. You're also going to want Anti-Phase for the sniper damage bonus. Tactical Combo for the weapon damage bonus. Then you'll want Marked Strike and Bounty Hunter for the Bullseye keyword linked bonuses. Then for the last 3 options, you're going to want Deviant Energy Defense for the shield that it gives. And you'll also want Tactical Leap and Aerial Suppression. Aerial Suppression will give you damage reduction against any type of enemies in the game. Now I do know it says just from monsters, but if we have this equipped right now, and we take a look at our stats, currently I have 0% damage reduction. If I just jump and I take a look at my stats again, you'll see that I have 30% damage reduction against Deviants, Rosetas, and Vultures. The same thing goes for Tactical Leap, however, unfortunately, it does not work from only jumping, and you have to use certain equipment or foods to make that happen. So the description is for every 1 second spent airborne, gain 20% damage against Deviants. This here, however, is still 20% damage against any type of enemy, not just Deviants, and also 10% damage against their shields for 3 seconds, stacking up to 60 seconds. So if I have this equipped right now, you'll see that if I jump, I don't get any of the bonuses. So of course, if you're in a Visional Wheel server, you can definitely make use of the gravity neutralizers, which pretty much make it so that you can just stay in the air. Or if you're in a non-Visional Wheel server, then you're going to want to use the drink buff that I recommend. But just for the record, right now I have around 7 seconds of this buff, and if I take a look at my stats sheet, you'll see that I have 20% damage bonus against Deviants, Rosetas, and Vultures. And the same thing goes for the shield damage bonuses. Moving on to the food buffs, starting with the food slot, the mixed fried hot dogs will be the best option. They provide increased damage against marked enemies, which is the strongest multiplier since they count as damage against X type, a damage multiplier you don't have a lot of compared to all of your other multipliers. And it's going to be very easy to trigger that because you're literally using a Bullseye weapon anyway. As for the drink buff, there currently isn't any drinks that buff this weapon's damage, so of course you'll want to use Stardust Energy Drink to easily trigger Tactical Leap's Cradle, which, in case you forgot, is 20% damage against Deviants and 10% damage against their shields. Moving on to substats priority, starting with the weapon mod and the mask mod, you're going to want to use Violent Suffix. Here, although you can have the keyword suffixes, which are Bullseye suffixes, you don't really want to run them because you lose out on total multiplier if your mods roll well. So for instance, with the Bullseye suffix, the most you can have would be 18% crit damage or 12% weak spot damage. You will not get any weapon damage from the Bullseye suffix mods because the linked attributes are either Bullseye trigger chance or Bullseye duration, which is pretty bad because you're going to renew the mark yourself anyway, which is why you're going to want to go with Violent Suffix because it can give 15% crit damage and on top of that 6% weapon damage bonus. And if you're lucky, you might also have 2 linked attribute on your mod, so you could definitely go for even more reload speed. But for general attribute, you're going to either look for 1 damage bonus against X type if you get 2 linked attributes, or 2 damage bonuses against X type. Of course, preferably have the rolls roll into the main type of enemy that you want to have damage bonuses against. Then, for the helmet and for the top mod, you're going to want to go with Lunar Suffix preferably, and the reason for this is because they scale much higher than your normal Violent Suffixes. So Violent Suffix can give a maximum of 15% crit damage and 6% weapon damage, whereas Lunar Suffixes can give 30% crit damage and 12% weapon damage, which is essentially the double of what Violent Suffix gives. And according to this chart, you'll see that it's very easy to get a lot of value from Lunar, actually much more than Violent Suffix, and at around 70% HP, you are already getting more value out of a Lunar Suffix mod. But of course, if you do not have Lunar Suffix mod, then you're going to want to go with Violent Suffix. Then, for the last 3 pieces, so for your pants, boots, and gloves, you're going to want to go with Violent Suffix with weapon damage as linked attribute. Ideally, you also get reload speed bonus as your second linked attribute, but getting 2 linked attributes per mod can be pretty hard to get, so usually you'll just go for 2 damage bonuses against X type of enemy as general attributes. And of course, once again, with the mod rolling into the main kind of damage bonus that you want to get. Now, before talking about mods to run, I just want to share that if you aren't sure how mods work or how and where to get them, then I've got this mod spreadsheet for you to check out. Every mod in the game is in there, and the link will be in the description and pinned comment. And now, starting with the Doombringers mod, you're going to want to run Vulnerability Amplifier for that extra 8% vulnerability, which will increase your damage. You wouldn't really want to go with the other options. So for instance, you wouldn't want to go with Spreading Marks since it doesn't really matter, you're using a Bullseye weapon. You'll inflict the Bullseye effect yourself anyway. Then for Hunter's Perk, this is mostly for PvP. And as for Recover Mark, it's just recover HP and 25% stamina. Unless you mega struggle with survivability, you don't really need to run that. And the same thing applies for the Bingo. You're still going to want to run Vulnerability Amplifier for even more damage on your Bingo. Then, for your helmet mod, you actually have essentially two options. You have First Move Advantage, which is after reloading, crit rate plus 10% and crit damage plus 20% for 2 seconds. Otherwise, your other option would be Precise Strike, which is hitting a weak spot, grants weak spot damage plus 12% for 3 seconds, and effect can stack 3 times. Now, if you're bossing, then you would definitively want to run Precise Strike for that 36% weak spot damage bonus that you've already stacked with the Bingo. But let's say if you're clearing normal enemies, so for instance, if you're just doing Nightmare Silo, you're clearing the normal enemies or whatever, then you'd want to use First Move Advantage, since it's unlikely that you aim for the head, so you will gain much more from the 10% crit rate and 20% crit damage bonus. Then for the mask mod, the mod that you're going to want to use is going to be Targeted Strike, which is when hitting marked enemies, you get 10% crit rate and 25% crit damage, which is really good for this crit based weapon. Now for the other Bullseye option, that would be Most Wanted, which is attack plus 5% each time you mark an enemy, stacking up to 3 times. Now this will give less damage bonuses, so unless your substats on Most Wanted are insane and you don't have a good Targeted Strike, I would not recommend you using Most Wanted. Moving on to the Gloves mod, you essentially have two options. You have Crit Amplifier, which is 10% crit rate and 15% crit damage, and you also have Crit Boost, which is 15% crit rate. And here, because the Doombringer has access to a lot of crit rate already, the preferred mod here would actually be Crit Amplifier. But of course, you might have a bad Crit Amplifier and a very good Crit Boost, so you could swap between Crit Amp and Crit Boost depending on your own substats. Now moving on to the Boots mod, if you're running the low HP gear set, then you're going to want to run Rush Hour for that 24% permanent weapon damage bonus, because the description is every 10% HP loss grants 4% melee, weapon, and status damage bonus. And if you reduce your sanity all the way down there, you will permanently gain 24% from this mod. But if you're not doing the low HP preset, then you're going to want to run Covered Advance, as it's either less conditional or straight up gives more buffs than all of the other remaining options, since its effect is taking no damage within 4 seconds, grants plus 20% melee, weapon, and status damage for 30 seconds, which is obviously very good. Now moving on to the top mod, of course you'd want to pick a gold mod so that you can run Lunar Suffix, and if you can't run Lunar Suffix, then you're just going to want to run Violent Suffix, like I said, in the suffix and substats priority. But essentially, the gold mod that you pick doesn't really matter that much. Of course, if you want the survivability, you could go with Ardent Shield or even Critical Rescue, but currently I want the best substats, and for me, that would be Quick Comeback. Now lastly, for the Pants mod, the best Pants mod is going to be Critical Surge, which is when the magazine is empty, crit damage plus 15% for 12 seconds, each stack is independent, and you can stack these up to 3 stacks. So you'll be able to gain up to 45% crit damage bonus, which is insanely strong. And fun fact, Critical Surge is pretty much just Deadshot, but it works better for the low mag weapons, because Deadshot requires you to hit enemies a lot of time within a single mag. Now if you don't have access to Critical Surge, then of course you could always use something like 3 Strikes, which is for the first 3 hits after reloading, not exceeding 50% of the magazine capacity, weak spot damage plus 50%. So what this means essentially is, let's say you have 4 bullets in your magazine, then only 2 bullets will gain weak spot damage bonus. And if you don't have 3 strikes, then you could also run Reload Rampage, which is after killing an enemy, refill 2 bullets from reserves, refilling no more than 50% of the magazine capacity, and you gain 10% weapon damage bonus until the next reload. But this is it for this guide. If you wish to see more Once Human content from me, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn on the bell for any notifications. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. This is Mon, peace out.